Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this workshop. Um, I thank you all for your patience because attending webinars in this way can be quite tedious. It's very different from a face-to-face interaction. Unfortunately, I can't see or hear you all, but I hope you all can see and hear me. And if there are any issues with the bandwidth and audio, please bear with me. I'll keep track of that. So I'll begin. So I'd also like to thank Mr. Joshi for a very insightful session. And to pick up from where he left off, I'm going to first talk about responding to peer review comments. In a lot of the questions that you all asked in the previous session, I hope some of those I'll be able to answer over here. So I'm going to begin by talking about what is really peer review and why is it important. It serves as a kind of a quality control mechanism. So the peer reviewers are sort of gatekeepers of scientific integrity. So it is also considered the hallmark of scientific and scholarly literature. There needs to be someone who is, identifying whether the research is genuine, is it valid, is it novel, and is it even worthy of publication in a particular journal. So in a nutshell, what is the process? So as Mr. Joshi talked about how to structure and frame a good manuscript. Now, what happens after that? You submit it to the journal editor. What happens after that? The article is assessed by the editor and seeing whether it meets the scope of the journal or whether it is good enough for further processing. It'll either enter the review process or it will be rejected right then and there. That is called a standard desk reject. Assuming that the editor feels it is worthy of peer review, it enters the peer review process where it is sent to 2 or more experts in the field. Now, I saw a couple of questions asking about identifying potential peer reviewers. Now there is a trend where journals encourage the author to suggest peer reviewers. Ideally, they should not be from your own institution. It's not that someone you know very well or somebody who could be biased towards or against you. So you have to make that choice very carefully. But again, not every journal asks you for that. But if they do, you are free to make those suggestions. So then it enters the peer review process. The reviewers assess the manuscript, they give their feedback, and it goes back to the journal editor. Again, at this stage, the editor may choose to reject it or may send it back to the author for further revision. Now, this cycle could continue for more than 1, 2, or even 3 cycles, and it could still be rejected at the end of that process, or as the manuscript gets improved by the input of the reviewers and your responses and changes to the manuscript, it might ultimately get accepted. Once it's accepted, it enters the publication process. So what are the kinds of decisions that you get from the journal editor? Also, it's very important to understand that it is not the peer reviewer who makes the decision of accept or reject. The ultimate decision lies in the hands of the journal editor. It's very rare that the manuscript gets accepted without any revisions. It's very rare, but it does happen. Most frequently are these in blue: accept with minor revision, accept with major revision, reject with review and resubmit, and reject with or without review. So minor revision would be a couple of changes that are suggested by the peer reviewers. You need to make those changes and you're good to go. Major revision would involve almost a complete overhauling of the manuscript, including a couple of more references, maybe a little tweaking of your experiments, maybe repeating of experiments. So all that might take time. Reject with review is that so many changes are needed that the journal asks for a resubmission. It is considered a different submission altogether. And reject with or without review It is a part of the scientific process. It is nothing to be dejected about. It will only help improve your manuscript and your chances of acceptance later. So typically, the comments from a reviewer look like this. So it will begin with some general comments. I have blacked out those parts because this is part of a document that I got to edit. So these are the general feedback from one particular reviewer. And then there will be specific comments or technical comments. There are major comments and there are minor comments which could be about language and typographical changes. Now, I'm hoping that a lot of you are asking, how do I go about responding to these comments? It's very important because besides the changes that you make, how you frame your response is really going to go a long way in the acceptance of your manuscript. So as soon as you get your comments, read them, go through them, but do not be in a hurry to answer immediately. And I'll tell you why. Somebody has given you feedback about your manuscript, which is almost like your baby. Somebody is finding fault, criticizing, certain points about the manuscript. It is bound to make you a little angry or upset. So which is why a lot of experts advise that you should not immediately start shooting out responses. Sleep over it. Take a day or two to calm down, and then you begin. So as I said, this is an approach called the calm method. So first is keep your cool, comprehend all the comments, then begin to answer them. Make a list. You have to do it in a very systematic way. There may be 2, 3 or more reviewers. Try to segregate your responses and list them out sequentially. Be mindful. So what does that mean? Whatever changes you have made, make sure they are clearly pointed out so that the editor or the reviewers, if it goes back to the reviewers, they are able to navigate your response carefully. So if you are careful at this stage, it just speeds up the process. And what all is needed in your resubmission? A resubmission cover letter, a list of your responses, a document with the track changes or the changes that are highlighted in a different color, and a clean version. This is actually optional, but the main 3 things are your document with the changes, list of responses, and cover letter. So typically, your cover letter would look like this. You insert the date of resubmission, you address the journal editor, and then you begin by saying that you want to resubmit your manuscript. All the details should be there. The title of the manuscript, you would have got a manuscript ID number, mention that. Be very polite in your responses. You should thank the journal editor and the reviewers for their time. Thank them for their valuable inputs and all that. And then you mention that accompanying this letter, there will be the detailed responses to the comments. And then you sign off. So typically like a cover letter, but slightly modified for resubmission. So the second part of the resubmission package will be the file with the responses to your comments. So as I said, divide them. First you label the file, responses to reviewers, and then you go reviewer wise. So reviewer 1 may have had multiple questions. I've just put in 2 over here. You need to repeat the questions that they posed, and in a different color, you answer their questions. Answer it, justify, and if you have made changes in your manuscript file, identify where you have made those changes, the page number, the line number. So this is what that file would look like. And then third would be your manuscript file with these highlighted changes in a different color. So in the response letter, you identify the line number and page number as well as over here. So as I said, this will make it navigating through your changes easy for the editor. Just a couple of questions. What if you are unable to address a suggestion made by a reviewer? Say addition of, a picture or something that should have been taken at the experimental stage and it cannot be repeated. This just as an example. So if there is something that you are unable to do, and there are valid reasons for that, you should be honest and indicate. You agree with them that while you agree, you did not think of it then, you were unable to do it, and ask if any alternative measure can be used. So if there was an image that you could not capture, can you show it in the form of a flow chart or something like that? Now, what if, now this is a very, very common question that I get from students. As you can see this image over here, does it say turn right? Does it say turn left? It's hard to tell. So similarly, two peer reviewers, two or more, might have diametrically opposite comments. What do you do in such a situation? It's very perplexing. Ultimately, the prerogative lies with you as the author. You are not to act as a referee between these two reviewers. Who do you agree with most? So see which reviewer you agree with more and follow their advice. Don't try to reconcile or contradict them. And if this cannot be sorted out, at the end, who acts as the referee is the journal editor. So he or she might have to intervene. But at the end, you have the final say as the author. So comments from peer reviewers go a long way in improving the manuscript. So there are a lot of issues now. There are a lot of these stories you might be hearing about recent retractions related to COVID papers and all that. But there are a couple of examples where peer review fails to catch some issues. But overall, for the foreseeable future, peer review is going to continue to be a part of science. So because it offers an excellent opportunity to improve the quality of your manuscript. And as I said, if it gets rejected despite these changes, you can submit to a different journal. But remember, do not send the paper to another journal without attempting to address those concerns. This will, if you can address the concerns of journal number 1, your chances of acceptance in journal number 2 will only increase. So in a nutshell, how do you go about responding to reviewers? Provide an overview, quote the full set of reviews, be polite and respectful, accept the blame if there was some error in your original version. The response should be self-contained. Respond to each and every point raised. Do not try to skip or miss any point. As I mentioned, yes, use typography to navigate through your response. Begin your response with a direct answer to the point being raised. Do not beat around the bush. Whenever possible, do what the reviewer asks. Be clear. And if necessary, write the response twice if two reviewers have asked the same question. So that was just a very brief look into peer review. The major part of my session today is going to be about ethics in research and publishing to avoid the unfortunate case of retraction. There's a very famous saying, if I had seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Sometimes, however, the giant shoulders you were standing on is nothing but a pillar of life. So ethical issues are a global problem. They only seem to be increasing. And this is just a few headlines. There are just too many cases to quote. And thankfully, there are people who are mindful of all these issues. And there are some self-proclaimed watchdog institutions that keep track of these issues and keep the scientific community posted on these kind of cases. The best known today is Retraction Watch. They have a blog. They are there on Twitter. I would highly recommend that you follow them on Twitter. They update their database on a daily basis. Why are such watchdogs needed? Because the retraction of papers are not announced and the reasons are not publicized. When your paper gets published, what do? You try to spread the word, you put it up on your researcher profile, you will share it with friends and family. But in the case of a retraction, nobody would do that. So this needs to be highlighted. So researchers or the public who are unaware of the retraction may make decisions based on those retracted papers. And it's a part of science. It's a part of the self-correcting nature of science. So Retraction Watch has a leaderboard. This was updated just a few days ago. And yeah, I know the names are very tiny, but in a nutshell, in the top 33, 32 of them, these researchers with retractions are men. Quite interesting. Very few women. Another point is most of them are Asian and many of them are of Indian origin. This is a very, very worrying trend. And this is particularly important and of the essence now in the current scenario. It's so worrying to see that as of yesterday, 22 papers related to COVID have been retracted. 3 have been temporarily retracted and there have been expressions of concern. Sorry. Yeah. So given this scenario, there are ethical standards for research during public health emergencies as laid down by WHO. So whoever's interested can actually go to the WHO website and have a look at how things are different in the case of a pandemic. Coming to what do you mean by research integrity and misconduct? Integrity in research is a responsible conduct of research. Researchers are expected to adhere to the highest standards of integrity and ethics, and any breach in this is considered misconduct. So the United States has an Office of Research Integrity, and they define research misconduct as follows: fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research or reporting. As I showed in that leaderboard, things are quite bad in India. It is unfortunate that a lot of high top-ranking scientists are embroiled in cases of plagiarism, falsification, fabrication. And at the root of this lies this pressure to publish, as well as a lack of proper training and ignorance. A lot of these must be happening because researchers are not aware about what really comprises misconduct or unethical practices. So which is why I'm very glad that you all are attending this session, because I hope that a lot of questions will be answered about these practices. So just like ORI in the US, India has a Society for Scientific Values, and it's an independent body of scientists in India, and they act as a watchdog to keep track of cases of breach in research integrity. Why is research misconduct harmful? It is because the nature of science is such, it creates a sort of a ripple effect. So there are just 2 examples. One is a very, very recent example. You might have heard of these papers that recently got retracted from the Lancet and NEJM. Those papers were based on a very, very unreliable data company called Surgisphere. And these papers ended up being retracted. But what were the implications of this? The WHO and many, many governments ended up changing their policies. They stopped trials and treatment on the basis of this flawed data. In other case, this is an older case from Japan. There was a researcher who had ruthlessly plagiarized work, fabricated data, forged authorships, and it ended up in retraction of more than 60 studies. Again, a lot of trials, a lot of policies and all were based on that study, and all of that had to be pushed back. And to reiterate, this ripple effect is particularly worrying in the current pandemic. Besides all that, it even affects the researcher. It can lead to a loss of funding, employment. There could be legal actions. It causes psychological distress. The reputation is spoiled forever. The proceedings are time consuming. And of course, it really hampers scientific progress. Main reasons are honest error. So you could be completely unaware that you are conducting, sorry, you are participating in something like this that is considered unethical without knowing. So that's an honest error. Misconduct is when you knowingly do it, you knowingly falsify your data, fabricate it, all these various aspects which I'll be talking about in a bit. And then there are cases where it's unclear. You cannot really make out whether it is honest error or it was truly a morally corrupt reason behind it. What are these matters related to integrity and ethics? So, starting from the objective of your study, the experimental material or subjects used, the methods that you use, the way that you are reporting or presenting your results, and publication. So at these 5 steps, there could be cases of ethical issues. So to begin with, research objectives. These are if your study breaches some kind of ethical, cultural, or institutional restrictions. Topics such as human cloning, human genome editing, bioterrorism, and this could vary across countries. So for example, in India, determining the sex of the fetus is prohibited. Now, for each case of each type of misconduct, I will be giving some examples, and most of my examples are going to be based on this one particular case. I don't know if you're aware, but last year a Chinese scientist was in the news for creating genome edited babies. So to begin with, the objective aspect, Dr. He Jiankui, his objective, his very premise of the study was flawed because it was a controversial and banned, proscribed topic of genome editing in humans. The second place where you could go wrong is research material. So for example, the use of endangered species. And this could be in the case of plants and animals. Material obtained without knowledge or consent. This could be human samples. It could be samples of plant varieties you're obtaining from farmers or indigenous tribes without prior consent. And also if there is a conflict of interest. So for all these aspects, if you are not sure, is your material, could it pose problems later? There are plenty of guidelines. There's the Environment Protection Act. There's the PPV FRA Act if you're using farmers' varieties. There are institutional boards for biosafety control. So make sure that you check these guidelines before you go about starting your research. Objectionable methods. This would include how you are treating the experimental animals or people. Have you obtained consent from them? Is your sampling biased in any way? So back to Dr. Jiankui. The questionable ethics in this case was he did not even declare the ethics very clearly. There was a very, very short ethics statement, and it was very fishy because he said that it was registered with the Clinical Trial Registry of China, but that date was after those genome edited babies were even born. There were also concerns that the parents were coerced into participating in the experiment. Objectionable ways of reporting your findings. So this would include fake or touched up images, fabricated data, falsifying data, not reporting inconvenient results. So you already have in mind what you want to present as a finding, and you very conveniently neglect or don't highlight parts that don't agree with what you want to present. That is also unethical. Making false claims or even overstating results. Now back to this example, he completely falsified the dates of birth. He overstated some claims about some off-target mutations during his trial using this CRISPR genome editing. These points I'm going to go in very much in detail. because this is where we end up making a lot of mistakes knowingly or unknowingly. Ethics in methods, reporting, and publishing. So we'll first talk about methods involving animals, involving humans, fabrication and falsification, authorship, salami slicing, plagiarism. A lot of questions we got on plagiarism, so I'm hoping we'll get some answers. Predatory journals, Mr. Joshi spoke about also. I'll go into a little more depth. And also this very interesting thing of fake conferences. Ethics of conducting animal research. It is very important to get the approval from the required bodies. Why is it important? To make sure that the animals are being treated in a humane manner with care. And there are animal care policies and standards, and you need to make sure you are adhering to them, because there are standard guidelines, not just at the institute level or the country level, but even internationally. And also to confirm that no alternative methods exist for conducting the experiment. So remember, there are the ARRIVE guidelines. These are international guidelines for reporting studies involving animals. In India, there is something known as the CPCSEA, Committee for the Purpose of Control and Supervision of Experiments on Animals. So you should visit these websites if you are engaged in such research, the ARRIVE guidelines and the CPCSEA. What you need to remember if you are using animal experiments, the main thing is the 3 R's. Very important: replacement, reduction, refinement. Replacement means if there is an alternative model, say a tissue culture model, an in vitro model, or a computer simulation that you can use instead of using the animals itself, try that. Reduction is a reduction in the number of animals. So the minimum number of animals you can use while still maintaining that required statistical power. Refinement would be tailoring your experiment in such a way that the suffering is minimized for the animals. In the case of humans, so at the end of World War II, this Nuremberg Code came into being for the importance for some kind of ethical code in human experimentation came into being after the very unfortunate series of events that happened under the Nazi era. Then came the Declaration of Helsinki. It keeps getting amended. I think the last amendment was in 2013. And of course, at the institutional level, we have the ICMR ethical guidelines for biomedical research on human participants. This has also been recently updated. And for human participants, the ethical principles fall under respect of the person, beneficence, and justice. And these are the 12 general principles. You can have a look at it, but there is really no point in me repeating what is written over here, because it is available in these resources. So if you are engaged in trials involving humans, make sure that you go through these resources. So the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants, it's freely available. There is also recently released National Guidelines for Ethics Committees reviewing biomedical and health research during the COVID pandemic. And of course, your trials should be registered with the Clinical Trials Registry. So check the guidelines of your target journal also if they specify any particular guidelines that you need to follow. So in summary, when using human trials, ensure the confidentiality of the participants, ensure that you obtain informed consent before involving them in the study, and follow every ethical guideline to avoid rejection or retraction of your study later on. Coming to fabrication and falsification. So a very high, although it says 1.7% of overall papers were retracted for image falsification. It seems like a very small number, but it's a very significant number. This should be 0. There should be no image falsification or fabrication. But again, a lot of researchers are not aware of what is allowed and what is not allowed with your images. These are just a couple of headlines from India. So fabrication and falsification is a slight difference. Fabrication is when you just make up data or results out of thin air. And falsification is when you manipulate your findings, you manipulate your materials, equipment, processes, or the results. So at sometimes you do need to edit your figures, but what is acceptable and what is not? So 7 points that you need to remember. Always have the original unaltered file available. That should always be there with you. And discuss with your team members and your lab about what is acceptable image manipulation. So point number 3 is you can adjust the brightness, balance, or contrast of an image. That is allowed, but only if the entire image is subjected to that particular change. You cannot go to one particular band or one particular feature and try to enhance it. If you are modifying the contrast or balance or whatever, it has to be for the entire image. So here are some examples. Some of you might be working with gels, so you'll probably be familiar with this. You get a very exciting band. You feel like enhancing it, but please curb that urge to do that. Point number 4, all bands or features evident in the original image must still be visible. Don't try to adjust the image to make parts of it disappear. There might be some bands that are interfering with your very, very important findings. Don't try to hide them or make them light. Again, make sure the brightness and contrast are equal for multiple panels. So first I was talking about one panel. Even across panels, they should be equal. Do not remove background fuzziness so much that the background becomes white. And when working with gels, if you need to splice out lanes, that is totally acceptable. From one gel to another, you want to splice out those images, it is acceptable, but you need to indicate with a line where the gel has been spliced. So like over here, these white lines indicate that these were not in the original wells, they were from a different gel and the images have been moved over there. So these white lines indicate that this is acceptable. So a lot of misconduct is happening at this level, a lot of fabrication of images, and there are, just like I mentioned, retraction days, retraction watch, there are a lot of watchdogs or imaging sleuths or detectives, self-proclaimed again. My favorite one being Dr. Elizabeth Wick. She has almost given up her research career just to find these cases of doctored images. So while it is very easy now with available software to manipulate your images, it is now equally easy to catch these instances. So while you might be tempted to use the software to beautify your images, please resist the urge because you can be caught. And Dr. Wick has actually, thanks to her, some papers have actually been retracted from Nature because she caught these instances where images have been falsified. So to summarize, images related to your study are very important to the credibility of your work. And do not tamper with them. Follow ethical guidelines. Don't introduce, remove, obscure, or move any specific feature within an image. And if you have made any adjustments or software, please disclose the details in the method section. Any kind of disclosure will always help later. Authorship, another place where things can go wrong. Who is an author? Now, there are guidelines by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors as well as COPE, Committee on Publication Ethics. So they define an author as a person who contributes significantly to the conception, design, execution, analysis, and interpretation of the data, participates in drafting or revising the manuscript, approves the version to be published, agrees to be accountable for all aspects of the work. Now pay attention. All those designated as authors should meet all these 4 criteria, and vice versa, all those who meet the 4 criteria should be identified as authors. Those who don't meet those criteria end up in the acknowledgement section. So what I'm trying to say is, who is not an author? A supervisor 4 aspects: the design, execution of the study, drafting of the manuscript, and being accountable for all aspects of the work. So just a supervisor, provider of administrative support, funder, provider of laboratory support, these are not
Vandana, if you can hear me, we have lost the connection. Can you please?
Us. We're trying to get Selena back. Thank you.
really sorry for that interruption. I hope you all can hear me now. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So I was talking about questionable practices in authorship. I hope you heard the bit about guest authorship and honorary authorship. Very interestingly, I recently read about this thing where in Korea and some other Asian countries, people are even naming their children as co-authors just to boost their chances to to get a position at a university later on. So although the children were not involved in co-authoring the paper, it's highly unethical to include their names in this manner. So again, Dr. Giancoi made a very blatant disregard of authorship practices. He included the names of only 10 authors, but some of the doctors who were actually involved in creating those in vitro embryos were not included as authors. So tips: learn about the nuances related to authorship, decide who can be named as authors and in what order, consult the target journal's guidelines on authorships, and visit the guidelines at ICJME and COPE. Talking about salami slicing. So what is salami slicing? You have a big study and various results, and you feel that if you can just cut it up into 3-4 different papers, your CV will just become longer and longer. But that is not always advisable. So salami slicing, the definition is fragmenting the results of a single study and reporting them in multiple papers. It is considered unethical because why is it unethical? It harms science because it repeats information, increases the amount of literature, but the increment in the knowledge is actually very minimal. So try and avoid this practice. A paper will have a greater chance of publication as a full-scale study rather than as a fragment of a larger study. So you need to focus on the quality of your publication, not the quantity. Plagiarism. Very, very important and very, very common and not well understood. These are just a couple of retraction notices that caught my eye. I removed the names of the authors, but very interesting thing is people have actually plagiarized content from Wikipedia. I mean, plagiarism is wrong, of course, but to stoop down to the level of copying from Wikipedia just shows it's just really, really shameful. What is plagiarism? So it's not just copy pasting of text. So one kind of classification could be wholesale plagiarism and mosaic plagiarism. So in wholesale plagiarism, the author borrows or steals material completely written by someone else and submits it as their own. Mosaic plagiarism, in depth if you go, verbatim is where someone copies the words or phrases without placing them in quotation marks. Mr. Joshi also spoke about this. If there are some definitions or something you cannot reword, you're free to use that text, but it has to be in double quotation marks along with the cited source. Conceptual plagiarism is a gray area. It's where a researcher incorporates facts or distinctive ideas from a source without attribution. Structural plagiarism would be where your approach to a problem has been copied from someone. Now, these are conceptual and structural are a little far-fetched and a little difficult to define and catch. So I'm going to be talking more about the verbatim plagiarism. So it occurs when authors don't give credit to previous work done. They don't credit the techniques used for conducting the research or the people who developed them. Pass off opinions and ideas of others as their own, like conceptual plagiarism, and using content from their own published work without acknowledging earlier articles, known as self-plagiarism. And many scientists are unaware of this. In fact, while I was doing my master's and PhD, I came very close to committing self-plagiarism because I just wasn't aware that it was not allowed. I thought it's my own work. Why can't I just reuse it or recycle it? But you cannot. It's been published. It is now covered by copyright. You need to cite that and not recycle it. What are the reasons? Why does this happen? It's very interesting because some authors think it's just not necessary. It might be common scientific knowledge. In some cases, in some cultures, junior authors think it is disrespectful to change the words of their senior authors or senior scientists. Third, people who are not fluent in English think it's okay to just copy paste because they're not confident of their own language. And again, they may not be confident of paraphrasing a technical description. So how can you avoid this? When you are unable to paraphrase, again, this is a repetition, enclose the text in quotation marks and insert a citation. So this is again for a case where you absolutely have no other option, like a definition. But you can't do that for the entire manuscript. The rest of it has to be in your words. So when you paraphrase or summarize, you rewrite in your own words but retain the original meaning. Even if you think it is common scientific knowledge, you need to cite the author. And if all else fails and you're struggling with this, you can always take the help of professional language editing services. A lot of people ask questions about tools for checking plagiarism. So there are these: Authenticate, Plagiarisma, Urkund, and apparently Urkund has tied up with the Ministry of Human Resources and Development in India and is available in about 1,000 institutions in India. So you could check that. But also, as Mr. Joshi mentioned, it will not catch instances of conceptual plagiarism. And if you look at the report, a lot of it will be because your methods, references, author information, these chunks of text cannot be reworded. So when you get a report after a plagiarism check, you have to make sure that certain sections are not included in the check to avoid a very high percentage of similarity. And Editage also offers a plagiarism check service. So you could just check out these tools if you like. Attempting to pass on someone else's work, words, or ideas as your own is unethical. You could lose tenure, funding, or credibility as a scientist if you're found guilty. So please follow ethical practices, apprise yourself by attending such workshops and reading more about research ethics to avoid these kind of instances. Predatory journals are very interesting and worrying trend. Mr. Joshi spoke about them a bit. They capitalize on this pressure to publish. As an early career researcher, you're in a hurry to get the maximum publications. You would do anything to get a publication. And these predatory journals act on that weakness of yours. How do you identify them? So they ask for an upfront fee. They promise very, very quick publication. They will say that there is no peer review or peer review within 2 days, which is unheard of. They will not show a proper, clear address. The impact factors will be fake. And if you look at the spam folder of your inbox, if you are a researcher, you will actually see tons of these predatory journals asking you for inviting you to write a paper. Mr. Joshi also mentioned, do not fall for this. This is right from my own spam folder, this IJCRT journal. I think someone even asked about it, Journal of Creative Thought, Creative Research Thoughts or something. So how do you identify if they are predatory? They just look very suspicious. If you go to the website, it is all cluttered with just so much information. They are really trying to advertise how great they are. They will put up this ISSN number. Now, an ISSN number, if you go to the website of a well-reputed journal, they will not tout it like that in big letters. And as once Mr. Joshi very aptly put it, it's like putting your Aadhaar card number on your CV. It's really of no use. So any journal that, puts up this unnecessary information and promises that sound too good to be true, just stay away. International Journal of Creative Research Thoughts. So while the name also sounds very suspicious, if you go through whatever is written, the language used, the English, the grammar is very poor, which is not expected of a highly reputed journal. If you click on certain links, the links will say, oh, we are affiliated with this, that, we are indexed in Scopus. You go to the link will be a dead link. It will not lead you to any of those sites. So look for all these warning signs and stay away from these predatory journals. And again, Mr. Joshi had mentioned this Clarivate analytics. You can search for authentic impact factors. If you check for these journals, you will not come up with a result. There are also these lists, Beans lists and Cabell's resources, but as far as I know, they are paid So to access these links, you need to pay. But just for knowledge sake, it's good to know. Earlier, they used to be called whitelist, which were the good journals, reputed ones, and the blacklist, which was the predatory or suspicious journals. Interestingly, in this whole Black Lives Matter, early this month, they have changed these names of whitelist and blacklist to journalistics and predatory reports. Another way of spotting predatory journals is this Think, Check, Submit initiative. They have a checklist. Go through this checklist, and if you can answer yes to most of them, it should be fine. The journal should be safe to publish with. Okay? Is it, first of all, you think, is the scope well within your work? Is it trusted? Do your colleagues or peers know of the journal? Are you able to identify and contact the publisher? Is it clear about the type of peer review it uses? Is it indexed in the services you use, like Web of Science, Scopus? Do you recognize the editorial board? Is it a member of any recognized initiative? So go through this list and see, tick mark whatever works. So this is a true story about a researcher, early career researcher in a hurry to publish. He received an email from a newly launched journal inviting to publish with them. The journal was not on the list of predatory journals, and it had some very reputed names on the editorial board. And a colleague of his was on the board, so he checked with him. And so anyway, he went ahead and sent his manuscript to the journal, and later on, he found out that there was something fishy. And he did not get a response for very long. So he went ahead and submitted the same manuscript to a reputed journal as well, because he was not sure about this predatory journal. But that is a big problem, because then the predatory journal goes ahead and publishes that manuscript. So then, if you have the same publication in two separate journals, even if one is predatory, it might end up that the one in the good journal gets retracted because of prior publication. So this is why you need to steer clear of predatory journals. They will try to extort money from you when you request a withdrawal. So better not get into that situation. And like predatory journals, there are even predatory conferences. Although for some time now, we don't need to worry about that, because physical conferences, I don't know when next will be possible. But similar to predatory journals, they are cancelled as soon as you pay the registration fees. They are organized at vague venues that are not advertised. And they will feature very eminent speakers who don't show up or drop a session suddenly. So just like the Think, Check, Submit initiative, there is a Think, Check, Attend initiative, again with a checklist. You go through that checklist, and if you can answer yes to all of them, the conference should be safe. There was also some talk on the lists provided by UGC. They keep updating these lists. And in fact, last year, I found that there was even a fake website. Somebody had gone to the extent of creating a fake UGC website with fake journal lists. So this is what the authentic UGC website looks like, and this is what the fake one was. So you need to really make sure what you're looking at is the correct website. Predatory journals do that. They even hijack some temporarily. They will hijack the link of an authentic journal. So it's very, very insidious, very, very scary, the practices that they follow, which is why we as researchers really need to stay on top of things and be aware and discuss and attend such workshops to stay aware. So in short, be careful when selecting a journal. Use known journal selection tools and databases. Avoid direct invitations to contribute. If you are at an early stage of your research career, no one is going to invite you to write a paper. That happens much later when you become an expert in your field. Look for these warning signs. What are the warning signs? promise of a quick review, quick publication in a matter of days. A very cluttered website like what I showed you with too much information. The website has poor language. The address and email IDs are very strange. It will be an unofficial email ID like a Gmail or something, and dead links that don't work. So what can you do to make a difference in this scenario of so much poor integrity, poor moral compass, or even lack of knowledge on research ethics? So it is important to conduct periodic review of scientific records, assess workloads across your lab, and there should be discussions on ethical issues at all levels of education. Even in school, there are students who are copying essays, they are copying statements of purpose when they apply for grants or for admission abroad. So at all levels of education, we need to inculcate this importance of integrity. So educational programs in schools and colleges are important, and reward people for reinforcing ethical conduct. Try to deter misconduct through mentoring, avoid peer pressure. There should be scientific audit. So you have these weekly or monthly lab meetings, right? So in that, besides the progress of your scientific work, openly discuss issues of research misconduct. Talk about recent incidents. What do people feel about it? Have an open discussion about this. And not just that, do your bit to expose plagiarism and fraud and not leave it entirely to mass media. If you suspect someone in your lab or someone that you know is engaging in this, bring this to the attention of your institute or someone senior. Avoid treating misconduct as taboo, and yes, discuss it openly. Be aware and keep abreast of the latest news in research and publication ethics. I think this is what is most important. You know, I conducted a workshop on ethics in December, and in these 6 months, so much has changed. I really had to update my slides because within these 6 months, the number of retractions, all these cases of fabrication, plagiarism, so many new ones have been arising, and particularly now with this infodemic of information that we have. So I think attending workshops, discussing it, and also reading. So these are some resources which I highly recommend you follow, at least weekly, if not daily. Microbiome Digest, Retraction Watch, Heritage Insights, COPE. Go to these websites, and because of shortage of time, I'm guessing I may not be able to answer a lot of your questions today, but you will get a lot of your answers from these resources. So that brings me to the end of the session. Questions? I can see there are many. Okay. Okay, someone has asked, when uploading photographs, oops.
Sunena, maybe I can help you with the questions. First of all, thank you so very much. That was extremely helpful. As you were presenting, we had a lot of questions pouring in already. So I can start with the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
You are asking
yes,
them?
Yes.
Or should I?
So also may I ask Mr. Joshi to join us for the question and answers round? We can take up questions from both the sessions. Meanwhile, Sunena, can you tell us, is being an editor of a journal and publication of a research article, if it's in the same journal, will it be considered as a research misconduct?
Very good question. It's not really misconduct. It is discouraged. It is definitely discouraged. Like, one should not use one's position to just increase the number of papers just because you're the editor of the journal. It would not really fall under misconduct, but I would say it's highly discouraged.
Okay. Is there any particular time span within which the revised manuscript should be sent back to the journal, or one can take their own time?
There is no specific time as such. It's better, the faster the better. So try not to take too much time. I would say within a month or two. And if it is taking too much time because of additional experiments or something, you need to notify the journal editor because they are not going to wait forever or keep track. So I would highly recommend that you just do it as soon as possible.
Okay.
Within 1 or 2 months.
Does the reviewers always list out the changes that should be incorporated in the revised version? And what is the acceptance rate for the revised manuscript when it's a major revision?
Okay. So whatever changes they want, they will list out, of course. If they don't list out, if it's not there, then they've not, yeah. Second, the acceptance rate, it varies. There is no number. I would just like to say that don't get your hopes up because there still could be rejection after that. It would vary from journal to journal, this percentage. I think I saw a number somewhere saying 43% or something, but I mean, it's very hard to give an exact number.
Is it possible to submit the paper in 2 journals at the same time with different titles?
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
Definitely not. The titles are different, but if the papers themselves are the same, it is incorrect. It is highly unethical. You have to submit one manuscript, that one version, in one journal at a time, not more than that. You cannot have different versions circulating all over.
Sure.
Don't do that.
If a paper gets rejected and after the revisions, is it recommended to submit the manuscript in the same journal, or should one choose a different journal?
If it is rejected, unless you have a very, very solid reason, you could try resubmitting it. But a rejection just means that they're saying no. But I have seen cases where an author, writes an appeal and tries to appeal reverse the decision. But I think it's absolutely okay to then go with a new journal if it's been rejected.
What is meant by retraction watch and why is it needed?
So retraction watch, as I said, it's not a regulatory body as such. It's just a group of scientists who have got together and they monitor cases of research misconduct and they put it up on their database. So it serves as a tool for researchers to identify retractions and other cases of misconduct.
Okay. There's another interesting question. Someone says if someone does data fabrication and poses a hypothesis and publishes that work, someone else cites this dishonest paper in their genuine work, will they also have to have their paper retracted?
It might be. If it's something that really impacts second paper a lot, if it impacts the conclusions, they will have to apply for a retraction or at least some sort of notice. They will have to inform the journal editor immediately that this is what has happened. And then the journal editor will decide whether it needs to be retracted or simply post a notice of concern, an expression of concern.
What is meant by conflict of interest and how to ensure that there exists a conflict of interest?
Okay, so a conflict of interest would be if you have a relationship with, say, a funder or some kind of financial employment related relationship which could influence your study results. For example, you are testing a drug and the manufacturer of that drug has funded your study. So that is a potential conflict of interest. Now, that doesn't mean that it's wrong, but you just need to disclose it. You need to declare. You might have seen in manuscripts there is something called a section for disclosures. So you disclose that conflict of interest, and then the journal editor will decide if it's something very serious, if it could really impact your results, and then they'll choose to publish or not publish it. But how to ensure, the main thing is if you feel there is any kind of potential conflict of interest, you need to disclose it at the time of submission in the cover letter as well as in the manuscript.
Someone says that I've worked in a lab during my summer internship and produced some data which is now being published, and the authors and the corresponding author are denying me an authorship. What should be done in this scenario?
But you are, I'm hoping you are including their names as well. So if you're going to be a sole author, that would be wrong. But if you're including their names and they have participated in that study, I don't see why they are saying no to that. And the problem is that you have worked in that laboratory and you are no longer a part of it. So that could be an issue. It will have to be resolved at your end. You'll have to talk it out with them. And
could I also answer
don't
this
go ahead
question,
and publish
Sunaina?
it without
Could I
their
take
consent.
the
That is the main
yeah.
thing. You have to
See, the
work out.
point is what the questioner is saying, that the
Yes,
questioner
yes.
worked at the
Please,
lab
please.
and then left it, and his or her colleagues in the lab are going ahead with publishing the paper and not giving authorship to the person. Yeah. Now, I think one of the things that one must do, I mean, it's you have to play it by the ear, but you could approach the head of the laboratory or the institute that you worked and tell them that, look, this is the case I worked and these are my data. I participated in the experiment. I am willing to share the authorship, and why is it being denied? And if you happen to know the journal to which it's being submitted, you could still take a chance and at least lodge a protest. Don't just take it lying down. You need to do something about it.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Joshi. Someone asks, what if the reviewers do not agree with your conclusion? Maybe, Sunaina, you can talk about how the authors can politely agree with the reviewers and stand their ground if they're sure about the results and the study that they are submitting.
Exactly. So I think in one of my slides also I showed that you politely disagree with them. There is nothing wrong in disagreeing with the reviewer, because at the end of the day, you know your study better than anybody else. So if they, I don't know if I could go back to those slides, it's like very much in the beginning, but be very polite, number one. Number two, you should be able to justify the reason with sufficient evidence. If you have citation to a certain study or any kind of evidence from your study that backs your conclusions over theirs, just provide that. But I think that should be fine. And at the end of that, it's going to be the journal editor who decides. It's not the reviewer. So even if you are disagreeing with the reviewer, the editor is going to take a call whether what is right and not, whether to go ahead or not. I hope that answers the question.
When two authors are contributing equally, can there be two first authors?
Yes. There is a provision where you can mark the two names with a symbol, and at the bottom you can say equal authorship or equal, both authors should be considered as first authors. There is a provision for that. Yes.
To incorporate an information from a scientific article, should one just copy paste and give reference, or paraphrase it and give reference?
It has to be paraphrased. There's no way you can just
Sorry, I
reproduce
didn't
it
hear that
verbatim.
clearly.
Okay.
Because if you do, then that is certainly going to be caught in when they run a plagiarization check, because it will match word for word.
Yeah.
So there's a question on,
should I look at the questions in the chat? Or?
Is it ethical to publish a paper based on a PG PhD thesis that has already been accepted by a university? Do we need permission from the university before publishing this paper? Any specific ethical issues they should consider when publishing a thesis as a research paper?
So as long as you cite the thesis, I think you know that you can cite your thesis. So as long as you cite it, there should be no problem. And you can also in the covering letter mention that this work was part of your thesis. But there is nothing wrong.
I
in
go
that.
with that. What you said is
Mr. Joshi, what would you say?
so long as you're citing the thesis and you mention in your covering letter, that should be fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it possible to publish a paper without giving the PhD supervisor authorship on that paper if they have not contributed anything except providing funding and laboratory space?
If he or she is your supervisor, it is unlikely that the contribution is only funding and laboratory. I mean, considering that it's the supervisor, I would say it's very hard to not include them unless
See, it's
there's a very
possible,
strong
but
reason you
let me
feel
also,
they've not supported your research actively.
Tell you what are the possible implications. Now, it is quite possible that your supervisor is better known in the field than you are. Let's say that you submit your paper without including the supervisor's name and it goes for review. It is quite possible that some of the reviewers may know of your supervisor and may wonder why is it that when your affiliation clearly shows that the work was done in that supervisor's lab, how is it that the name does not feature? After all, it's not a question of giving the first authorship, certainly not. But I would say you need to really think hard about switching off the supervisor altogether.